Hi there. With the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo now in Riyadh for talks with King Salman over the Khashoggi case, what is the likely political fallout of this case and what possible repercussions on world financial markets could we see? And a group has claimed that Harvard University discriminates against Asian American applicants in order to benefit blacks and Hispanics. Has positive discrimination now gone too far? Welcome to The Point. I'm Michael Wong, sitting in for Liu Xin. Well, Jamal Khashoggi, a critic of the Saudi government, went missing more than 2 weeks ago after he entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul. Turkish officials have said they believe the 59-year-old was murdered there by a 15-member Saudi assassination squad. A Turkish newspaper, Sabah, has reported that Khashoggi may have recorded the moments he was allegedly tortured and killed on his Apple Watch, which had synced with his iPhone that he had left with his wife outside the consulate, although some experts do dispute this, saying it would be technically impossible for that to have happened over in Turkey. Now, on Friday, a delegation from Saudi Arabia arrived in Istanbul as part of the investigation into the writer's disappearance, while on Monday, King Salman ordered his public prosecutor to open an internal investigation into this matter. Now, Turkish investigators, some wearing overalls, gloves, and covered shoes, later entered the consulate and stayed for about 8 hours, leaving in the early hours of Tuesday. Now, they reportedly took with them samples including soil from the consulate garden. Now, Al Jazeera is now reporting that Turkish police will next search the Saudi consul's residence. Later in the day, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo landed in Saudi Arabia's capital, Riyadh, for talks with King Salman and the Crown Prince. Now, it is expected that he may then head to Turkey. And now a number of news outlets are reporting that the Saudi government is preparing to say that Khashoggi's death was the result of an interrogation by Saudi operatives that went wrong. Now, Saudi officials are expected to claim that the mission was initiated to interrogate Khashoggi, not to kill him. So what are the likely international ramifications from the disappearance of the Saudi dissident journalist? And how does it reflect on the Saudi Crown Prince, Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS? And joining me from Istanbul is Serkan Oral, a political analyst and writer. And from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute. And gentlemen, welcome to you both. Ivan, I want to start with you because the recent highly charged exchange of words between Washington and Riyadh now appears to have given way to a mutual search for the least bad explanation. Both countries' leaders know they have an enormous amount to lose if this affair ended up splitting apart their 73-year-old strategic partnership. And many would find the interrogation gone wrong story that is now being widely floated doesn't really sort of hold water, considering this 15-member team that flew into Turkey was identified as special forces and not interrogators. So do you think it likely we will ever really know what happened? And are you sort of cynical enough to believe that the truth might be doctored to save faces for both sides?
Yes, I think that's what they're doing, and I think that Trump has a lot of business connections with Saudi Arabia, and also, of course, the United States government depends on the Saudis, or at least they think they do, to contain Iran, and also they also believe that Saudi Arabia is the linchpin of the world oil market, which is, of course, has also been overstated, but nonetheless they believe this. But I think Jared Kushner and Donald Trump benefit from business ties to Saudi Arabia, and certainly the Saudis have been filling the hotels here that Trump owns in the United States, and on purpose. And I think that's what's driving this this attempt now to cover this up. And the problem is the story is ridiculous, and it's not true. And that the Saudis may, Trump may have even suggested this to them, or perhaps they're suggesting it to Trump. I'm not sure which, but anyway, it's ridiculous. And even the story is damning, that they were interrogating him and they tortured him to death. That's no better than just outright murdering him. So. And he is a U.S. resident, and he writes for a very prominent paper in the United States, the Washington Post. So this is a problem for the Trump administration here at home, and with Saudi Arabia and with Turkey and with other, around the world.
Okay, and Serkan, I want to get your take on this as well. Do you believe it likely that Khashoggi would have been detained in the consulate and a 15-man Saudi team brought in from Saudi Arabia without the knowledge of the Crown Prince?
Exactly, there is a connection between MBS. It seems that these 15 people sent it quickly for Khashoggi to Istanbul. But the things are really gone wrong, because from the very first day of these disappearances, Turkish authorities get the evidences from his smartphone clock, and I believe that the voice recordings are can be publicized to the world in a near time. Then this will be more clearance on the issue. But Turkish authorities are saying that he is killed in the consulate from the first day. But after 14 days, the consulate didn't answer anything, and they didn't tell about the future of Mr. Khashoggi. But the things are coming more clear point. The criminal issue started like this, but now it's an international crisis between Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and the rest of the world. Everybody was really shocked. Now it's just like a James Bond movie, but the difference is the actors are all Saudis, and the projections are now on the Crown Prince.
All right, so there's certainly a lot to unpack here. There's lots of implications on the geopolitical front, so let's try and unpack all of this and unravel all of this, starting with Saudi-U.S. relations. Iran, as the regional rival to Saudi Arabia, would be the prime beneficiary if the Saudis were to lose their defensive U.S. umbrella. And President Trump is also correct to say that thousands of U.S. jobs might be lost, which begs the wider question, is the West's relationship with Saudi Arabia so important? Ivan, I want to ask you this, that it outweighs the need to condemn and punish what many believe was a state-sponsored murder of a journalist inside a consulate.
No, I don't think it is. The Saudi connection has always been overrated, and oil always hovers around in the back, and you don't hear it comes up every so often. But the Saudis, you know, cartels, no matter whether it's a tin cartel or aluminum cartel or whatever cartel it is, usually it's raw materials. It's never been very successful, and OPEC hasn't been very successful either. There are non-OPEC producers. There's the Arabs have to sell their oil more than the West has to buy it, etc. So that's ridiculous that the oil. Now Iran, the United States, Obama was trying to have a better relationship with Iran, and Trump pulled out of this nuclear agreement. And he shouldn't have done that, because things were getting better with Iran. They had suspended their nuclear program to some extent as far as making weapons, and so this was improving. So I really don't see why we need to buddy up to the Saudis as much as the United States does. Also, I think the Saudis and the Israelis are cooperating under the table against Iran, but you know, a better relationship with Iran wouldn't kill the United States. So there's both the oil and the Iran issue really don't go there. So I think the Saudis really need to atone for their sins here, because the Turks can't let them kill somebody on their soil, and the United States can't let the Saudis kill a U.S. resident who's writing for a major U.S. newspaper. So, you know, this is really a problem. And I think a larger issue here is this guy, MBS, who's really running Saudi Arabia. He's very reckless. He's got into a war with Yemen. He's jailed his own family members to extort money out of them in the Ritz-Carlton Hotel, you know, and now this. And I think the United States really ought to look to see if this guy is too reckless for us to have him as an ally.
Okay, and Serkan, to you, MBS's sort of aggressive posture against Iran has won the support of President Trump and his administration, which pulled out, of course, that Iranian nuclear deal. Iran, of course, very skeptical of a lot of these things that the U.S. administration is currently doing, and I'm wondering if this whole episode puts this new relationship that was struck between the Trump administration and Saudi Arabia at risk, or do you think the Saudis are working on the principle that there is a greater priority from the Trump administration to carry on this relationship forward due to its leverage with Iran?
You're right. If you have a future target, for example, as Iran, then Trump will not let Turks and the Saudis have a deep conflict. So Pompeo's visits, both Riyadh and Ankara, will show that they are trying to cover this Ivan Khashoggi issue, but Turkey also, it seems, has softened the reactions to this issue. Today, for example, President Erdogan softened his reactions and said that their goal is to reach a conclusion that will create a conviction. These words came after with the telephone call with the King of Saudi Arabia and also the common researchers from the consulate. But it doesn't matter. Even this event, after the Crown Prince's movements, Turkish President Erdogan says Turkey will be the real leader of the Islamic world. You know, Saudi Arabia is the protector of the two holy mosques, Mecca and Medina. Then this special event will be questioned, this administration. And if Turkey and Saudis are in a deep conflict, then Iran issue will be on the ground in Syria and Iraq. So the tension, the U.S. tries to get the tension down.
Okay, Serkan, I want to stay with you really quickly. Of course, this also ties in with Turkey's relationship with Saudi Arabia and Iran as well. Saudi Arabia making a call to Turkish President Erdogan of Turkey. How much at risk do you think are Saudi-Turkey ties at this stage?
Turkey can announce that the consulate general as a persona non grata after this event, but still Turkey has problems with Saudi Arabia because of the Qatar issue. Turkey supports Qatar. Qatar is under blockage of the Saudi Arabia coalition. And the second thing is, especially Turkey knows that Saudi Arabians are supporting the YPG terrorists in the northern Syria and Iraq parts. Turkey get the evidences on this issue. So it seems that if in the near future the kingdom will pay for these events, then something will change because of this side. But you know, don't forget that Turkey has good relations with Iran, Russia in this region because of the border security issues.
All right, Ivan, we've got maybe about 40 seconds left. I just want to get your take in terms of how the economics and financial prospects of this are all going to play up. On the oil front, do you think that we might see oil spiking up to potentially $100 or $200 a barrel if the Saudis do indeed retaliate to strong words from Washington?
Well, they can do it in the short term, but OPEC can't control the price, has been a failure in controlling the long-term price of oil. So I think that threat is somewhat overinflated. I do agree with your other participant that despite what I said the United States should do, it's probably not going to do that. Trump is already working to cover this up, and he's sending his Secretary of State to hang out with these guys who've just probably murdered somebody, a U.S. resident in a foreign capital in their consulate. So, and I think Turkey, they want to make hay out of it because they're opposed to Saudi Arabia to some extent, but I don't think they want it to go too far. And I think so. I think that Turkey, the U.S., and the Saudi Arabia all have an interest in sort of muting this. But I don't know. The cat's out of the bag. This excuse they're coming up with now that this was just a rogue interrogation gone bad. That's ridiculous, and I don't think that's going to fly. I think the controversy is going to keep going here.
All right, we're going to leave it there, gentlemen. Many thanks for your insights. Serkan Oral, a political analyst and writer, joining us from Istanbul. Also, Ivan Eland, a senior fellow at the Independent Institute, joining us from Washington, D.C. All right, folks, we're going to take a short break, but when I come back, we'll be looking at the results of positive discrimination in America that some say unfairly targets applicants of Asian American descent. Stay with us. Welcome back. Well, a case alleging that Harvard University's admissions process discriminates against Asian American applicants opened on Monday in the Federal District Court in Boston. At the core of the case are claims from a group known as Students for Fair Admissions, or SFFA, that Harvard engages in unlawful racial balancing that benefits African Americans and Hispanics but hurts Asian American applicants. And Harvard has, of course, denied such claims begun by conservative advocates who hope to end racial affirmative action. The case, which could go on for 3 weeks, could even go as far as the U.S. Supreme Court. Now, as President Trump has replaced the court with a more conservative justice, Brett Kavanaugh, some believe the case could be a landmark to overrule the action, which endorses the use of applicants' race as criteria in screening to ensure campus diversity. So where is this case going, and has the affirmative action led to positive discrimination, and how will Asian Americans improve their political involvement? Joining me for more discussion on this are Rick Dunham, Director for Global Business Program at Tsinghua University, as well as Victor Gao, Vice President for the Center for China and Globalization. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on the program. Rick, I want to begin with you because this case was filed initially back in November 2014 by Edward Blum, who is the president of the SFFA, the Students for Fair Admission. So why do you think it's taken this long? Now, of course, we're in October of 2018 for this to happen.
Well, justice in America often is slow. And in this case, there was what's known as discovery, meaning there were a lot of confidential documents that the plaintiffs in the case, the people suing Harvard, wanted to get, and there was time required to get them. So I don't think it's extraordinary that it takes this long, but I think what's extraordinary is the importance of the case when it's finally decided, which will go to the Supreme Court and probably come out in the next 18 months or 2 years.
Okay. And Victor, Harvard obviously denying that engages in any kind of discrimination against any sort of ethnic minority. But in the United States, we have in our junior year or 11th grade, you see colleges already sending out papers and materials to potential applicants. And we have some stats here from the Students for Fair Admissions because according to them, African American, Hispanic, and Native American students with top grades who hit at least 1100 on the SAT, full score is 1600, they get these flyers about applying to Harvard, but it's much higher, 1380 for Asian American men and 1350 for Asian American women. So what do you think about this? Clearly, there is something going on here.
Well, first of all, affirmative action is a very important initiative in the United States. Whether it is perfect or not, no, definitely. Whether there is room for improvement, definitely. However, affirmative action is intended to cover minorities, including Hispanics, Afro-Americans, as well as Asian Americans. Now, generally speaking, there are indications that Asian Americans tend to score higher compared with probably a couple of other minority groups. However, whether these are all necessary and sufficient reasons for universities to admit the Asian Americans versus the other minority students, that's the question, I think, to be debated and to be further investigated in this particular case. Definitely, if you are an Asian American student applicant with higher score but not getting such notice, you will feel bad, you will feel upset, you will feel kind of discriminated. And I think there is reason for them to feel grievances and make their cases known.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there are claims that Harvard actually screens applicants via several soft factors as well. For example, likability, right, which is very subjective, one may say. Rick, what is your take on this, basing admissions factors on these kind of traits?
Well, to me, I am, like many Americans, deeply conflicted about affirmative action. We want diversity. We want diversity in terms of race, diversity in terms of economic backgrounds. At the same time, if you admission to colleges is a zero-sum game. If you discriminate in favor of someone for diversity, somebody else is a loser. And in the case of Asian Americans, particularly Chinese Americans and Indian Americans, there is discrimination in these subjective factors, and there's no question of it. There have been stories written about this. Chinese Americans are downgraded on these personal subjective characteristics. Now, and that's just unfair. Now, all of admission is subjective. You can't just say, we're having one test, you have a number, if you're above it, you get in, if not, you don't get in. So there's some subjectivity, but to me, where you have numbers like this and there's clear discrimination, that Chinese American applicants, particularly Chinese American men, get lower scores for leadership, for working with others. There's something wrong with that factor, and it needs to be adjusted so that you don't have that discrimination.
Maybe perhaps it comes back to our definition of diversity then, in terms of what actually ranks as diversity. You can be diverse in race, but could it possibly be more important for diversity of experiences, right? Diversity of background, of living experience, working experience, rather than just based on race alone? What do you think, Victor?
Well, if you look at schools like Harvard, for example, they claim that they have a very robust system, which is not dependent on any single factor and which takes into consideration a whole range of factors and which will eventually yield a fair and objective result. That's their position. Now, of course, when we talk about diversity, it depends on which diversity group we are talking about. I would say the American universities more or less have achieved a good result in terms of gender diversity in the new classes, for example. But in terms of the diversity groups, minority groups, the Asian Americans, including the Chinese Americans, do have reasons to feel grievances, and the key is how they can make their grievances known, whether they can go through this legal process to win the case, for example, eventually, as you mentioned, all the way up to the Supreme Court, and whether the schools like Harvard, for example, will take into consideration the eventual result in modifying and improving their admission process to such an extent that the Asian Americans, who many of whom are very outstanding students, can get a better chance in getting into these elite schools.
So Victor just mentioned modifying admissions. Should we look at how the U.S. now admits students going forward, you think, Rick, in terms of perhaps blind admissions? So maybe hide the name or the ethnicity of the student and just simply evaluate a student based on his or her past experiences, diversity in experiences perhaps, sort of like, for example, seeing The Voice, right, these blind singing auditions. Could that apply to the education system?
You could. That's what conservatives want. I mean, they want an end of affirmative action and letting the universities decide. But the problem is it would work against diversity, and if your goal, societal goal is a diverse student body, in the case of Harvard in this case, they're saying rural areas that tend to be poorer with less educated people, we want to help them. So they allow white people in those areas to be recruited with lower scores. The problem is that if you're a Chinese American and you live in West Virginia, they don't want you with the same kind of score. So I think this is a question of tweaking and not getting rid of affirmative action. I do think diversity is good. When I went to college at the University of Pennsylvania, it was good to have people from all over the world, people from poor inner cities, people from the suburbs. I think it's an imperfect system, but I do think you need to keep tweaking it, and I think Chinese Americans and Indian Americans are the difficult issue now because schools are effectively capping the number, because if they were race neutral, you would have a disproportionate number of Chinese American students. And what's happening now is what happened to Jewish American applicants in the 1950s, which is that there were quotas that limited them and people who were qualified didn't get in. So I say there's no easy answer, but I think it's something that universities continue to need to deal with in an evolving way, not just saying don't consider any factor except the test score.
But does the appointment of Brett Kavanaugh to the Supreme Court, does that change the picture, Rick, in terms of what happens to affirmative action, you
I think marginally. The person he succeeded, Anthony Kennedy, was not the swing vote. I mean, to me, the swing vote is the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Roberts. Anthony Kennedy has been critical of affirmative action and very pro-business. So I think in this case, Kavanaugh makes it more likely that affirmative action will be either eliminated or scaled back even more, but I don't think that he is absolutely pivotal. I think John Roberts, the Chief Justice, is the pivotal person.
Okay. And Victor, how do you think this might all play out? Because we do see seismic demographic changes in the United States in terms of increasing Hispanic populations across various states in America. We also, of course, have growing African-American populations down south as well. So how do you think Asian Americans might deal with the situation going forward if the trial does not come out in favor of Asian Americans?
Well, definitely, if we look at the census statistics and forecasts, there will be mega trends in the demographic compositions in the United States. The white population, as a percentage, is expected to come down to below 50%, and the African Americans, the Latino Americans, and the Asian Americans percentages are each expected to increase. And I think for Asian Americans, their situation is a little bit difficult. They are different, but mainly because the Asian Americans are more fragmented, whereas, for example, African Americans are more or less defined by their the skin of their color. Latinos, for example, they all speak either Spanish or Portugal. In Asian Americans, they are more differentiated into Chinese Americans, Korean Americans, Japanese Americans, Indian Americans, for example, and there is less of a coherence among the Asian Americans, and I think this issue also needs to be addressed going forward in the coming years or decades.
Okay, we'll keep our eyes peeled on this. Gentlemen, many thanks for insights on this. Victor Gao from the China Center for Globalization, as well as Rick Dunham from Tsinghua University. Thank you very much for that. And with that, we're going to wrap up this edition of The Point. As always, you can always follow us on Facebook and Twitter using the handle The Point with LX. Download the application called CGTN to watch our show on your mobile devices as well, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again. Good time tomorrow.